Hello, everyone. We're going to wait a few more seconds until we start. Okay, so thank you very much for all joining us today. This is the first lecture in the BREAD-IGC virtual PhD course. Dave Donaldson and I are delighted to have the opportunity to organize this course for all of you. As hopefully you all know, it's a course on firms and development, and each week there's going to be different kind of guest lecturers on topics that are particularly close to their research expertise. And today we're going to be giving a kind of overview and a kind of framework for thinking about the subsequent 7 lectures. So a few words on logistics. So each week, about 20 of you have been chosen at random to participate as panelists. You'll be able to kind of raise your hands and potentially ask questions as in a normal Zoom call. The rest of you are kind of more traditional attendees of an event, and feel free to ask questions in the Q&A and in the messages, and either Dave or I will kind of select some of those questions and ask them out loud. We'll have time for a few questions today. As it's a kind of an overview, there probably won't be that much time for questions, but in later lectures, there'll be a kind of more back and forth we expect. So let me dive straight in and talk to you a little bit about the course and what we'll be covering over the next 7 lectures. So first, I'll very briefly provide an introduction, and then I'll present 5 facts and fictions about firms in developing countries, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Dave, who will be presenting a simple framework which we think will help us kind of organize the content in the next 7 lectures, as well as think about kind of interactions between different topics. Okay, so what's this course about? Well, I think the big motivational question is the same as in many development courses, which is why are some countries rich and some countries poor? And here we'll be taking a particular kind of lens on that, which is focusing on firms. Why firms? Well, firms large and small provide employment and income for most households in the world, as well as producing the goods and services that take up a kind of lion's share of households' budgets. So, surely firms writ large play a huge role in the development process. A separate but closely related question is, are firm-related policies potentially tools we should be using in order to reduce poverty, boost growth, increase development? That's a slightly more nuanced question, but the large role that firms play in the economy suggests there's certainly possibilities for firm-related policies to play a role. And if we look at kind of simple associations in the data, it's certainly true that the richer countries in the world, here I have GDP per capita in logs on the x-axis, and I have the share of employment in firms from World Bank enterprise surveys on the y-axis. And we certainly see a strong positive relationship. Countries where a larger share of firms, workers are employed in firms of size 5 or more are wealthier, and that's true also in changes. And so that, at least without making too much of causality, this is obviously clearly an association, is definitely supportive of the fact that potentially the growth of firms is a kind of a key part of the development process. So, can policymakers intervene to generate firm growth? That's a question we'll be trying to think about in this course. If they can, should they be doing so? And if so, exactly how? And here, myself included, many economists and policymakers, have seen the kind of rapid growth in East and Southeast Asia, plus the kind of the huge expansion in market activity, private sector employment, as well as market activity more generally, and have kind of linked that to fairly extensive firm-related policies in those countries, and seen that as some evidence that indeed there is a kind of a place potentially for firm-related policies, and understanding which ones and how to do them seems of first-order importance. And so this mini course is going to take the evidence from a kind of vibrant and growing literature on firms and development to try and kind of sketch out the issues, what we know about them so far, and kind of where the open questions remain. Okay, so with that, let me dive kind of straight in. And the first thing I'm going to do is present kind of 5 facts and fictions about firms in developing countries. Why do I say facts and fictions? Well, all of these are kind of things you'll hear a lot about firms in developing countries. Some of them we have very good evidence for. I'll kind of think of those as facts. Some of them, the evidence is more limited or ambiguous, or more work still needs to be done. And those some of them may be closer to fictions. So let me kind of dive in and present those 5 facts. Okay, so the first fact is one I'm sure all of you are aware of, and that is that aggregate productivity is much lower in developing countries than it is in developed countries. What do I mean by aggregate productivity? So here's kind of one version of this fact. We have GDP per capita on a log scale on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we have total factor productivity. What is this? This is a residual when you regress log output on the capital an economy has, plus the labor it has, where you adjust the labor for the kind of level of schooling of those workers. And so here we're thinking about kind of what can't be explained by differences in inputs used in different countries. And it turns out that this object, this aggregate total factor productivity, explains more than half of cross-country differences in GDP per capita. And this is kind of the fact that lies behind this kind of claim that if we're able to increase aggregate productivity, we'll be able to go a long way to closing the gap between the world's poorest countries and the world's richest countries. So, this is one of those facts where, obviously you can debate exactly how to calculate aggregate total factor productivity, but I think few people would disagree that there's huge differences in such an object between rich and poor countries. Now, just because we can agree on that fact doesn't necessarily mean we can agree on why that's true. And broadly speaking, there's 2 different reasons why total factor productivity on aggregate might be much lower in developing countries. The first is that firms themselves might be less productive. So think about comparing 2 firms which are in some sense equivalent. The one in the developing country might be much less productive, much less able to turn certain sets of inputs into outputs than the equivalent firm in a developed country. So that's kind of one route that could lead to lower aggregate productivity. The second is related to the kind of allocation of resources across firms. And it could be the case that in developing countries, resources are allocated much less optimally or much less efficiently, such that the firms that aren't able to produce a lot of output with a set of inputs are have a much larger share of the economy than firms that are. So inputs are kind of skewed towards less productive firms would, for example, also lower aggregate productivity, even if the kind of typical firm in the two countries was equally productive. Okay, and we kind of think about that as misallocation, which has been kind of a key object of study in the recent literature. Okay, so that's our kind of first our fact. We're now going to explore those two channels, whether firms are less productive or whether the least productive firms account for larger shares of GDP. So first, are firms less productive in developing countries? So this is actually a surprisingly difficult question to answer because measurement is obviously challenging. One approach is, focus on countries where we have, maybe rich data on firms, including their input use, and then calculate, like we did across countries in the world, this residual from regressing kind of the output of an individual firm in terms of quantities on the inputs they're using. And what's left, we're going to call productivity, or TFPQ, and we can kind of compare the distributions of that across countries. And Shea and Klenau have famously done that in some recent work. And there it certainly does indeed seem that poorer countries, looking at any point in the distribution, firms are less productive in less developed countries. Another approach is to try and circumvent some of those measurement issues, which kind of mean it's kind of hard to know exactly how much less productive they are, and instead focus on a kind of single industry where we're able to better understand the technology, and then maybe we're able to do a much better job controlling for the inputs firms are using, even going as far as controlling for the machines firms are using. One approach, one paper that kind of follows this approach is the work of Gregory Clark, who goes back to 1910 for this comparison and looks at the textile industry. And what's kind of interesting there is firms across many countries in the world were all using the same machines, essentially the same set of machines being made in the UK at the time to produce textiles. And then we can compare how productive workers are on the same machinery. And here we see stark differences, for example, in the number of looms that were operated per worker, comparing New England or Canada at the time versus, say, India or China. There was a factor of 4, a factor of 6 difference between the number of looms being operated per worker. So kind of one measure there of productivity that's kind of much more direct. And in kind of further work, Clark has updated some of these over time so we can get some more recent comparisons. The one particularly interesting measure is DOFs per hour. So a DOFer, for those not very familiar with the textile industry, is the person who takes off the spindle, which has been kind of filled with yarn as part of the spinning process, and basically takes it off, puts it in baskets, and then they go off to sell those. And that DOFer, their task is basically removing things and taking them away. And in India, we're doing, say, in 1944 to 49, when we have measures for all three, we're able to DOF 124 of these an hour, while in the US, a single DOFer was taking 770 spindles off. So you see really quite dramatic differences in this case, worker productivity on the same machines across different countries. So that's kind of another way where, at least where we look, we see potentially large differences in productivity between developed and developing countries. Another approach is to think about kind of the technologies, the ideas, the management techniques that firms are using. There, we're going to have to typically rely on surveys, asking firms what they're using, what they're doing. Recently, there's been some progress made here by the World Bank, who has this nice new set of data on technology use across a variety of different developing and more developed countries. And here, what they're going to do is they're going to get experts to try and write down, how sophisticated different technologies are in particular industries, and then find out what technologies firms are using, and then create a technology index. And this is early days with this type of work, but already there's interesting patterns that emerge, such as the fact that the kind of gap between the kind of more developed countries like Korea, who are at the frontier, and the less developed ones such as Burkina Faso, which are far behind the frontier, that gap is kind of very large for the most productive firms. They're the ones at the frontier in Korea, but the kind of less productive firms, actually the differences in technology uses is not so extreme. Now, an important caveat here is, the fact that different firms use technologies doesn't necessarily mean they're doing something suboptimal. Obviously, factor prices differ, etc., and it may be optimal to use different technologies across different countries, and making welfare statements is going to be difficult. And this is something Dave will discuss more precisely when he turns to the framework in a few minutes. Okay, so another approach is, rather than something as ambiguous as technologies, where different firms may want to use different technologies depending on factor prices, for example. Another area of productivity that people have investigated in a lot of detail is related to management techniques and management technologies. And particularly influential set of work pioneered by Bloom and Van Reenen had the ingenious idea of focusing just on a subset of management technologies, which could be vertically ranked. And what do I mean by vertically ranked? I mean policies which potentially everyone could agree, or techniques that everyone could agree, some are better than others, and maybe it's not more costly to do a kind of a better strategy or a better practice than another. And so an example of this might be having a performance-based pay system rather than a flat pay system, or organizing your inventory in a kind of a way that means you can easily find what you're looking for, and stuff doesn't get lost due to a rot or damage. And so once we've kind of created these types of practices, which can be vertically ranked, and it's going to be a little debatable how vertical some of these are, but if we agree on that, then we can then compare across countries how good their techniques are, and that will allow us to potentially make some progress here. And when you do that, you see stark differences in management practices across countries that line up pretty strongly with GDP per capita. Okay. So this is all about technologies, management techniques, potentially differing across firms, and some of this will be related to the fact that firms in developing countries may be more productive than in developed countries, may be more productive than those in developing countries. If we're comparing, two equivalent firms, say, doing similar things across the two. A second question we may be interested in is, how resources are allocated across those two types of, across less and more productive firms, and that may also generate differences in aggregate productivity, as we talked about a few minutes ago. And this leads to our third fact. And the kind of first part of it is that when we look, we see potentially very large distortions in input and output markets, both in developing countries and in developed countries, but maybe more so in developing countries. So what do I mean by distortions here? Thinking about, say, input markets, we're talking about poorly functioning capital markets, onerous labor regulations, poor institutions that make it difficult to write contracts that will be enforced. All of these types of things will distort firms' input use compared to a kind of a undistorted economy. There also may be distortions on output markets, things such as markups or taxes. Do we know that these distortions are larger in developing countries than developed countries? Certainly, there are many literatures that kind of assume that is true and provide various pieces of evidence in support of that. In a recent handbook chapter, Dave and I have tried extremely heroic in the sense that we have to make assumptions that are likely not to be true, but allow us to make progress, and we hope are not too far from the truth. What we're going to do is we're going to take World Bank enterprise surveys, use kind of quantitative responses in those surveys to try and calculate wedges across both inputs and outputs and various different types of wedges. And by wedges, I mean anything that drives a gap between the price a buyer pays and the cost to the seller. And we can kind of think about kind of wedges created by regulations or the need to pay bribes to get things done, wedges due to crimes, such as kind of theft of output or inputs, and wedges or distortions due to markups, domestic taxes, as well as input distortions, whether they come from tariffs on imports or capital market distortions, raising interest rates or rationing credit, or labor market distortions through regulation, etc. And when you go and try and do that, it does jump out that these distortions do appear to be larger, particularly the input distortions, regulation, crime, output distortions as well, appear to be larger in developing countries than in developed countries. But it's very difficult to measure these objects, and so this should be taken with a pinch of salt. We can also do this across different types of firms as well. If you pick a particular distortion in a particular country, you can often go further. For example, some nice recent work has looked at contracting frictions, which arise when it's in poor institutional environments. It's difficult to have contracts enforced. And what they do is they look across Indian states, which have different qualities of institutions, and in particularly have different kind of backlogs in their court systems on how long it's going to take for a case to actually come to trial. And they show that in states with more congested courts, then firms are using different bundles in order to make products, to make the same products. And in particular, the bundles of intermediates they're using are tilted towards standardized intermediates, which you can buy on markets and don't require relationship-specific contracts, for example, versus more kind of complex input. So here's an example of input use being distorted as a result of a particular contracting friction that we can identify. We can also look at various output market distortions. Here, as I mentioned, the evidence that these are more severe in developing countries is much more nuanced. In fact, I would say we have no answer to that question yet. And so this would fall into one of the kind of fictions, despite the fact that you often hear that developing countries have very uncompetitive markets, either because of crony capitalism or because of huge rents going to intermediaries and such like. When we actually try and measure markups, for example, following the method pioneered by Bob Hall and more recently Jan de Loca, the cost minimization approach, then we see huge dispersion in markups across countries. And when we're attempting to do a cross-country comparison, if you look at the African data here, you have two neighbors who have both some of the lowest markups in the world and some of the highest markups in the world, and it's hard to take these data too seriously. You maybe can make more progress again by focusing on particular industries where the measurement challenges are slightly ameliorated. And here's some recent work's been looking at cement. Cement's obviously an important input in the construction industry, which if there's kind of big distortions due to markups will obviously affect intertemporal investment decisions. Here we see that cement prices, as well as other important inputs, are much higher in the poorest countries than they are in wealthier countries. And this is, at first blush surprising, because we might think that in fact, input prices should be lower in the poorest countries, since labor is an important input into manufacturing these products, and labor is particularly cheap in the poorest countries. But in fact, as you see, the prices are higher in the poorer countries for these goods. So, obviously, the first thing we might want to know is this markups a distortion, or is this just higher costs? Maybe the other ingredients in cement are much costlier in developing countries. And if it is markups, for policy reasons, we might want to know, is this due to kind of uncompetitive conduct, the erection of barriers to entry by politically connected firms, for example? That's something you might be able to do something about. Or is it simply the fact that these markets are quite small, and so particularly if there's kind of high fixed cost industries like making cement, there may not be room for many firms, and that's naturally going to raise markups. And some recent work has shown that maybe that latter explanation is true, although there are also high costs in these industries. But again, this is very early days. There's very, very little we know about the level of competition in developing countries, the level of markups, and this is kind of one of these areas where we need much more work. Okay, so up to now, we've talked about the fact that the level of distortions might be much larger in developing rather than developed countries. But in order to kind of dramatically bring down aggregate productivity, often what matters more is not the level of distortions, but how those are distributed across different firms. And so, for example, a tax is a distortion, and if every firm faces the same tax, that's not going to misallocate resources across different firms. It's only if different firms face different tax rates that we may get this effect we talked about, where less productive firms are allocated larger kind of shares of the market, or allocated more resources, which leads them to have larger shares of the market, which brings down aggregate productivity. So what do we know about whether or not distortions vary across the size distribution or vary across other dimensions? Here I'll mainly be focusing on the size distribution. So, a classic work here is the work of Jim Tybalt. So this is as far as I know, the only really comprehensive survey on firms in development, although it's somewhat dated now. And in it, he documents something called the missing middle, which is something people had talked about previously. And here the idea is that there's kind of many, many small firms in developing countries. There's also a fair number of big firms. What's really unusual is the lack of firms in the middle of the distribution. And what might be behind that? Well, one or two sets of explanations that would generate that is both the presence of high regulatory barriers and a lot of distortions in the formal sector. And that means that these medium and large firms are kind of subject to, high taxes, a lot of regulatory burdens, etc. And so that's naturally going to mean there's going to be a lot of small firms. But at the same time, big firms are kind of big enough to get the attention of politicians, to benefit from cheap credit or subsidies of other types, or through generating political connections and handouts, etc. And so in that case, you'll see kind of a lot of small firms, but also some big firms doing well. And it's those firms in the middle who are really suffering from these distortions. And so we'll find this missing middle. And why do we care? Well, of course, if we're trying to design policies to help firms, which firms we decide to help is going to depend critically on where these distortions are largest. And this evidence would suggest we'd want to target firms in the middle of the distribution. But let me return to these size-dependent distortions in the missing middle in a few minutes before thinking of this as something of a fact. As you'll see, it will be disputed. A second large literature closely related to size-dependent distortions is asking this question: why are there so many small informal firms in developing countries? And here, Laporta and Schleifer offer kind of three views that have been very influential. The first view, they call the romantic view, is that there are lots of small firms because essentially it's all these regulations and difficulty borrowing, credit frictions, etc. And those essentially mean that high-quality entrepreneurs are unable to grow their firms and instead remain small. And this is an idea closely associated with Hernando de Soto. And in that world, the most distorted firms are these very small firms who find it, say, particularly hard to borrow, and you're going to want to go and help those firms in order to boost aggregate productivity. A second kind of view is a parasite view. And in that view, these small firms are actually very unproductive. They're not great entrepreneurs. In fact, they're not very good entrepreneurs. But the reason they're able to survive is because of the taxes and the regulations that bigger firms face. And they're able to avoid those by staying small, under the radar, or informal, and avoiding those costs. And in that world, it's the opposite. It's kind of the bigger firms who face the most distortions, and you'd want to help those rather than the small firms. In fact, the small firms should be driven out if you kind of reduce the distortions on the bigger firms. So you see very, very different policy prescriptions from these two theories. And then there's a third, a dual economy theory, where there's kind of two sectors, a modern and a traditional sector, and this traditional sector is more like a buffer. It offers a kind of insurance, a source of subsistence, not growth. Okay, so what's the evidence for these different stories and for these size-dependent distortions? Well, surprisingly little evidence, but one recent paper that's instructive here is the work of Shea and Atkin. They do a couple of things, but what they're going to do is like Shea and Klenau, is focus on 3 countries where we have very good data that kind of spans the entire firm size distribution. And they're going to focus on India, Indonesia, and Mexico. And what they're going to show first is that in those countries, at least, there is no missing middle. There's kind of a non-bimodal distribution. And their argument is that actually those kind of facts in Taibao come from basically kind of poor data coverage, where you're often missing certain types of firms when you're combining various different data sets. That's kind of the first takeaway, which says maybe we shouldn't be helping these firms in the middle or focusing on them because there doesn't appear to be this missing middle. The second takeaway is, what do we think about that romantic view? In that romantic view, it's these kind of small firms who are most constrained. As Dave will discuss more precisely, what we're looking for here to know if the small firms are most constrained is whether they have higher value marginal products than bigger firms. And it's a very hard thing to kind of measure the value marginal product, but Shea and Klenau looked for the average product of both capital and labor with different kind of firm size across these 3 countries. And at least looking at average products, we find the opposite, which is that the bigger firms have higher average products of capital, say value added per worker. It's the bigger firms who, on this dimension, appear more productive on average. Now, of course, they may not be more productive on the margin. That's what really matters here for knowing whether or not we should be allocating more resources to them. And so, again, this is one of those kind of facts which is very much uncertain and ambiguous until we have kind of some better measures of value marginal products as opposed to average products. They also shed some light on the parasite view, and that parasite view says we should be helping the kind of most productive firms because it's these kind of least productive firms that are kind of surviving only because they're avoiding regulation. And if that's true, then what we'd expect to see is kind of large a bunching of firms below regulatory thresholds, if indeed many firms are kind of staying alive because they're avoiding regulation. And at least when we look at labor regulations that bind at 100 firms in India, or VAT thresholds at various points in Indonesia, or tax regimes in Mexico, we don't see this bunching, which would at least be supportive of a parasite view. So kind of the takeaway here is, I think there's still a lot of ambiguity here on which types of firms are most distorted and where policy should be kind of focusing. And we'll kind of talk more about that later in the course. So my final fact before I hand over to Dave is related to industrial policy, and in particular related to kind of policies which are there to target externalities. You may want to help particular sectors because we think those sectors generate a lot of learning that spreads to other firms or to other sectors, or you might want to target particular firms, which again have large spillovers. Or more generally, industrial policy could also be targeted just to correcting those distortions we talked about earlier. So when thinking about industrial policy, certainly there was a consensus that built up amongst economists in the 80s and the 90s that we really shouldn't be encouraging it as economists. And in fact, we shouldn't be doing it at all. And this often, this was part of what became termed as the Washington Consensus. And the logic here was twofold. First, there's an informational constraint. It's really hard to understand which firms you want to help. It's hard to know which firms generate the most externalities, even which industries generate the most externalities. And it's hard to work out which firms are most distorted. As we talked about, we still don't know whether big firms or smaller firms are more distorted, let alone particular industries or sectors. And so that's kind of the first, an informational constraint. The second is that in practice, many of these policies seemed like they ended up being captured by politicians in order to reward firms who maybe help them in other ways. And because of this capture, essentially we should tie our hands and not do these policies at all because they just end up being corrupted. So this was certainly the conventional wisdom amongst economists. There's been some pushback over the years, maybe most notably from Danny Roderick. And his argument is that these types of issues, that it's information is hard and they're subject to capture, plague many other policy areas, maybe to different extents, but say, for example, education policy, health policy. And in those cases, we don't hold up our hands and say we don't know what to do. We should do nothing. Instead, we kind of try and muddle through the best we can because we think they're too important to ignore. And that would certainly be his view, and one I think I subscribe to as well. The kind of second point that he'd make is that a lot of the reason that we kind of shied away from industrial policy was this idea that previous industrial policies had been abject failures, particularly those in India or Brazil with things like import substitution strategies. And his response to that is it's so difficult to infer causality in these cases, particularly since they're often helping our firms that are most distorted, we may expect to grow the slowest absent any policies. And so, it's really hard to know whether or not the policies that were put in place historically did actually lead to benefits or not. And again, this is something we're starting to revisit, and Rekha is going to talk a lot more about in later lectures. One thing I think it's less debatable is that everyone is doing industrial policy. Countries didn't stop doing it just because economists told them not to. And in that light, we may want to think about telling them how to do it better if they're going to do it anyway. And here there's kind of new evidence which is on this picture here from Rekha and co-authors trying to document the types of policies different countries are actually doing over time. Okay, so those are my kind of 5 facts and fictions. Obviously, some things we're more sure of than others. And now we'll kind of turn to Dave, who'll give a kind of overview of the kind of course through setting up a theoretical framework, which will kind of guide the next 7 lectures and allow you to start piecing together some of these facts as well and putting them in various boxes. Okay, so let me undo my share and then hand over to Dave.
Thanks. Hope you can all hear me and see my screen. So yeah, my goal here is to in the remaining time to talk about like an organizing framework, I guess you could call it, sort of the bare bones of an economic model that allows us to think about sort of how to label different concepts that that appear in the study of firms in the context of developing countries and have already appeared in David's discussion and will kind of continue to appear in the coming lectures. And so kind of consider this a preamble, lots of details to be filled in by the lectures that follow, but something that hopefully kind of whets your appetite at the very least. So we're going to sort of go fairly abstract and fairly general at this point. I mean, the way I think about that is that the generality is useful because we kind of want to understand the limits of arguments, the assumptions, the minimal assumptions that are needed to make arguments. Hopefully, that's the value of generality. Abstract, I find it useful because it's means it's a fairly flexible, way of thinking about the world, and that can sometimes be a curse. It's maybe too flexible, but it can also sometimes be, yield powerful insights. And so for my own thinking, I find that a useful feature. Anyway, so we're going to imagine that there are these firms indexed by the letter I, and they each kind of produce a single good. We can embellish that and talk about multi-product firms and things, but today we won't. But these goods, they combine to produce GDP or development, in some narrow sense of the word development. And so one way of thinking about that is that they enter some sort of aggregate national utility function. So there's sort of a vector of goods whose quantities are consumed, this vector big Q here, bold Q. And obviously focus on national utility ignores distributional considerations. People might have different preferences, different incomes, that might be bad. But the main focus of a lot of this literature so far has not been on such distributional concerns. It's been on sort of aggregate productivity, sort of the question David started with, which is sort of why are nations richer than others? And that's inherently an aggregate question. Okay, so then sort of how are these cues produced? Well, we're going to sort of think very abstract here about them being produced in the following way. So, this is some function that's going to map inputs, which are these kind of x's. That's those bold xi is the inputs that this firm is using in this function, some arbitrary vector x, and this thing a that I'll come back to in just a second. And we want to sort of think about this function f as actually kind of being derived from some other function that I'll call sort of f tilde here, which is actually the firm is maximizing over. So this is not your usual profit maximizing decision that we can talk about in a bit, but this is almost like a sort of trivial precondition for maximizing, for profit maximization, which would be that this firm sort of thinks to itself, well, given that I'm going to put in X inputs, like let's just be concrete about that for a second. Imagine like one worker and that's it, no machines, just one worker. What is the best way of organizing production, conditional on using only one worker, to produce my output? Right. So that's what this function here says. So we're going to maximize over like ways of producing, quote unquote, or techniques, as I'll call them here, these T's. Now, of course, there's kind of probably some constraints on the techniques that are available. And that's what this says here. You're maximizing over the T's subject to the T's being in some set that I'll call AI. Okay, so you can see this is a fairly general way of thinking about things. So, this firm right now knows only about the set AI. It doesn't know, how else to produce conditional on using one worker. If it decided to use one worker and one machine, then of course different techniques would probably be useful for the right way to maximize output given using one worker and one machine. And on all of that, all of those discussions are kind of embodied in this. So anyway, we're going to ignore the T's for most of what follows, today. However, in subsequent lectures, things that might look like T's, kind of will turn up, and they're important because they basically give rise to what this function, the F function, is. This is where firms figure out the right way to sort of turn inputs into outputs, the best way to turn given inputs into outputs. Anyway, so from what follows, we're mostly going to focus on sort of this function, which is where, there's inputs that go in. How many inputs go in, we're going to talk about. But for now, just imagine there's an arbitrary vector of inputs going in. And then AI is this thing that indexes basically like how big is the set, how good is the set of techniques that this firm knows about in terms of making its output. Okay, so a crucial thing in today's discussion is going to be this at the bottom here. So, we're imagining that these inputs, these X's, are in fixed supply at the national level. So that's what this bottom constraint here says. It says that when you sum those little X's across for a given type of input, M, so by type of input, I mean like labor, for example, or, rubber gaskets, a given type of material input. For a given type of input, when you sum those input usages across the firm's I, they have a limit, which is this big X M. So for the type of input M, but there's a limit on nationwide how much of the thing we have. So this is going to be kind of crucial. We'll talk later about, relaxing it, like where does big X come from? But discussions of aggregate productivity typically, like the ones David's already shown you, typically hold big X constant. They sort of ask, given the workers we have as a nation, how much, in a sense, GDP or U can we produce? So they do already condition on aggregate sort of input availability. Okay, so, just to sort of say a few more notes about that previous discussion. So, techniques didn't there was no price of using techniques, right? So they were just ways of producing, right? So, and remember, think about this, we're conditioning on the X's. So often when you think about ways of producing, you're thinking about, should I use 2 workers or 1 worker in a machine? That's not techniques in this language. Techniques is like conditional on using 1 worker and 1 machine. How best should I do it? Okay. Now, of course, as I already mentioned, there's this sort of set of constraints on the techniques that the firm knows how to use. I'll come back to that kind of constraint in a second, but okay. So then, when we think about a technology, you know, it's really a recipe for mapping inputs into output, right? So that's going to be our definition of a technology here, and we're indexing those technologies both by sort of F at the AI, you know. So you know, obviously at this level of generality, the F is not restricted. You know, it can be different across the firms because the AI, remember, is indexing a set. So since that can be different, you know, everything can be different. It can offer kind of flexible returns to scale. It can offer non-homotheticities, which is to say at like low scale, you might, in some sense, produce more using a labor-intensive mix, and at high scale, you might produce more using a capital-intensive mix. All those sorts of things are totally possible. But a crucial thing to note about A is that A kind of by construction is going to be an index of like how good the function is, in the sense of like holding inputs constant. If A goes up, so does Q, kind of necessarily. Okay, so now just to reiterate, you know, this is nothing to do with how many X's will go into this firm, you know, which X's will go into this firm, will the firm be big or small, will it be capital intensive, et cetera. All those are great questions. We're going to come back to them, but for now, just conceptually, those are not the technology. The technology is the menu of options available. Okay, so, you know, just finally to reiterate, you know, the distinction between techniques and inputs is crucial. Inputs are constrained at the national level. You know, they remember I told you about this crucial aggregate constraint here. So if one firm's going to use a bit more of an input, some other firm has to use less of the input. There's no way of getting around that aggregate constraint. However, techniques are sort of free in the sense that, you know, they're constrained by the AI set, but otherwise they're free. So so we would sort of hope that you know, that they're being used when they're, you know, kind of appropriate, when they're worthwhile. The good techniques are being used up to the constraint. Okay, so then that begs the question, well, what does A capture, right? So remember, we're imagining that A is not something the firm can do anything about. It was a constraint in the firm's problem. You know, hiring more labor is not going to raise your A in the way we wrote it down. Hiring more labor does let you produce more, holding A constant, but it doesn't sort of, A would be like, even with holding labor constant, I can produce more. So think about A as like things that are sort of, you know, they of course have to obey the laws of physics. The laws of thermodynamics are inside A. There's only sort of, you know, there's only so much output we can get for a given amount of input. But also in a, you know, obviously in some sense, they're also going to have to reflect limits of scientific knowledge. Maybe sort of nobody knows how to, you know, squeeze more, you know, tons of wheat out of an acre of land than a certain thing that's embodied in A. Finally, however, it also appealed to 2 other very important notions that might make AI differ across firms, and this is what David has already alluded to. It would be sort of just, you know, we could start with ignorance. So, you know, remember, AI indexes the set of techniques that the firm knows about. So, so you could imagine that, you know, for some reason that is interesting and we should understand and try to, you know, contribute to, but for some reason, firm I just doesn't know about a wider, you know, the wider set of techniques that some other firm, not I, kind of does know about, even if they were producing the same thing. So that's an interesting hypothesis, that sort of ignorance or knowledge limitations, variations across firms, across countries is an important feature here. And second, I'd also point to kind of, in some sense, mistakes, or what you might call irrationality. You know, if you wanted to embrace the possibility that the firms are not sort of maximizing over techniques, that's okay. Just give them a shrunken A, just basically sort of define A as the ones that they do maximize over for the purpose of this discussion. So, think about that as kind of like, we know about some good techniques, but for whatever reason, we're deliberately not using them, even though they would literally let us produce more with less or more with the same inputs. Nothing to do with profit maximization, just to do with, in some sense, being on your own production possibilities frontier as a firm. We usually assume they are. This is just allowing for the possibility that they're not and indexing A by the possibility that they're not. Okay, so those are A's. Now let's go to the X's in this function. Remember, the X's are super different because they they're in constrained national supply. They're kind of costly. They're scarce resources. And so when you think about what's an X and what's an A, I find this very helpful because, again, remember, the crucial thing about X's is they're in fixed national supply, which of course means that if one firm is going to get more of an X of a given type of X, then another firm has to get less of that type of X. There's no way we can break that constraint that's embodied here. So, that's of course how economists have traditionally thought about capital, labor, human capital, maybe even types of human capital we could call managers, management services, that kind of thing. It's often how we think about material inputs, intermediates that are not necessarily material, but like, legal services that firms hire are intermediates. But I encourage you also to think about other things that firms use as inputs that are, in some sense, when they use them as inputs, they're using up society's scarce resources, like R&D. That's using sort of a particular type of time to try to produce an input that the firm will use. Search. We often think about that as maybe separate, but it's not. It's, the firm is using its time to sort of search for, I don't know, customers or suppliers or workers. There's marketing and advertising expenses, which is the firm using its resources to try to tell the world about its products or that sort of thing. Transport costs would very much belong here. And then finally, I'd make a comment that, nothing here, even though there's no time subscripts on anything, nothing here is inherently static. We just would need to let the X's kind of index, inputs at different points in time. And then that allows one to think about phenomena like, adjustment costs, hiring, firing costs, learning by doing inside the firm, where we know that if we sort of put in a lot of input in the past, we probably can produce more today. That would all be inside this kind of Q as a function of X function. All right, so with that all said, we can now ask some how this relates to development. So one way to think about development is to ask, well, what's the best we could do as a society, as this sort of hypothetical nation in this model? And that's, of course, a well-studied economic problem that goes back to Hotelling. Samuelson wrote seminal pieces on this. The planned economies of the last century used these results. Mathematicians developed these results to help those planned economies try to achieve the answer to this question, which is what's the best that we could do in this environment, right? So of course, that's like maximizing the national utility, where the arguments here are the Q vector. How much of apples do we want and how much of oranges do we want, et cetera. Those are all inside this Q vector. Subject to the limits of technology, which this planner that's solving this problem can't do anything about. They can't change the F, they can't change the A. So they cannot change the technology. They have to obey this law of technological kind of life, that whatever we produce has to be no bigger than F at the inputs we put in for every firm, every good. And then finally, also that other law of life, which is that the inputs are on aggregate supply, or constrained in aggregate supply, this one here. And of course, it doesn't make sense that inputs go negative. So that's what this constraint is doing. Okay, so of course, embodied in this maximization problem is the question basically, that David was alluding to, which is like, should that firm over there be bigger? Should that firm over there be more capital intensive? I was in the Q&A, lots of questions like that were coming up, and those answers to this question are embodied in this admittedly abstract but sort of general framework. Anyway, so as you probably have seen before, some of you, the solution to this is not hard to write down. The first order conditions look as follows. Basically it's crucial distinction is between sort of things that are happening, let's call them. So sort of inputs of type M that are actually going into firm I in positive amounts, strictly positive amounts. So let's call that sort of the active firms and inputs kind of set. So for I's and M's that are in the active set, then the following should be true, which is that sort of the marginal utility that's created from a little bit more of the output of that good I times the marginal productivity of putting a little bit more of input M into firm I, so, in order to get more of that output QI, that sort of pair of products there, du dq and df dx, should be equal to a constant, which I'll just call lambda star, where the constant, notice it does not, when I say constant, it does not have an I on it. So within any M, like sort of, for example, within the type of input M I'm calling labor, what this of course embodies, this is sort of that every firm has this, every active firm that's using some labor has the same du dq times df d labor. All right, that's what that says. So I'll put more economic intuition on that in a second, but for now, that's what the math says. And then, what about those firms that are not, those sort of firms and input types that are not in the produced or active set? That's the ones down here. Well, the statement here is just that those are characterized by the fact that, in some sense, the du dq times df dx of those firms, at that amount of 0, basically, has to be less than that aforementioned constant. So it's kind of like saying, for the firms that are producing using a given type of input, equalize their utility productivity. For the firms that are not using that thing, make sure their utility productivity, if they were to produce, is strictly less than that value that is equal across the ones that are producing. All right, so that is the best allocation. What good is the best if the real world isn't going to achieve the best? But I find it helpful to think about comparing the best to what actually happens in order to think about what went wrong. So this is going to let us kind of think about the word kind of misallocation that I'll come back to in a second. But let's just first talk about the best allocation. The actual allocation and how it compares to the best one. Okay, so to talk about the actual allocation, this is just going to be like a label. So let's just call the actual allocation whatever it is. I don't know where this came from. We'll get there, but for now, whatever it is, it has a Q, which I'll call Q bar for being like the one that actually happens. And then all the firms in the economy have, including the inactive ones, which, for which this would be 0, have an X bar for all the different types of M. So that's what this notation means, kind of, all the vector of all the firms in the world, in our economy, I mean. And let's imagine that the actual allocation obeys this aggregate input constraint. It doesn't, obviously it couldn't break it because that's physically impossible. This could be a less than sign. You can imagine the actual economy leaves some inputs unused, just leaves them idle. That's a totally valid possibility, I suppose, but not something we're going to sort of entertain here. Just for the purposes of some of these discussions, it's not so central, but for now, imagine that it holds with equality even in the actual allocation. So this economy might be using the wrong mix of which firms get the inputs. That could be totally screwed up. That's what we'll call misallocation in a second. But it's not so screwed up that like some people are just sitting idle. That, so in other words, this holds. Anyway, so the second thing, just to make this easy to talk about, is we're going to assume that sort of, again, this is really just, don't think assumption, think sort of like almost like a convention, in some sense, like for thinking about issues conceptually, think about this as a convention. But imagine that households, in a sense, are not distorting their consumption decisions. So that's to say that, through whatever means, markets, whatever, something or other, households are acting as if they're paying a price P bar, and they're choosing those Qs that they're buying that enter that utility function, such that the P bar is proportional to the marginal productivity. So of course, our usual model of like frictionless optimizing, untaxed consumers without any buying power of their own does display this. Price is proportional to marginal utility at the point the consumer chooses when it maximizes. So I'm just sort of in some sense pursuing a normalization or a convention where that is true, even though of course that might not happen. The reason we do this is sort of, I guess, I think people often think about that as almost sort of like consumption side distortions. Whereas most of the firm's literature has been more about what you might loosely call firm side distortions. And so that's a bit of an arbitrary distinction. A government could impose a tax, and it's not always well posed to ask, well, who's distorted, the consumer or the firm? In some sense, the problem is that the consumer and the firm aren't facing the same price. And but anyway, but we're going to just, basically follow this convention and in a sense kind of write this like that. So the power of that, I think, for the purpose of thinking about firm efficiency or production efficiency is the following. It's just a definition, but let's unpack it. It's just defined. Well, sorry, this goes by the name the value marginal product of input type M, the mth input. So if this was labor, you might call it value marginal product of labor, or VMPL. But whatever it is, let's just call it VMPX, because the M's don't have to be labor, of course. And it's just defined as follows. You take that price P bar that the households are paying, and you multiply it by the FDX of the type M at the actual point of production, right? The X bar. So obviously for any allocation and any set of prices, I can stick that allocation and those prices into this function, take the derivative at that point, and calculate the left-hand side. And I'm just defining that as the value marginal product. Why are we doing this? I'll get to that in a second, but for now it's just a definition. So a couple of comments, however, on this definition, just to bear in mind when you think about this stuff in the literature and in your own thinking. Three sort of comments. So the value part, the V, is really important. Firms probably produce different things, different goods. That's product differentiation. They probably produce, and by the way, when you think about product differentiation, of course, bear in mind that includes things that might be a little hard to see, like where is the firm physically located, and is it open 24 hours or something? So we have to remember to think broadly about product differentiation. But anyway, whatever it is, the cool thing about the V in VMPX is that the P bar, remember, is capturing the marginal utility of that good at the allocation. So, or at least proportionally. So it's going to sort of perfectly be almost like a sufficient statistic for the social value that the firm is creating on the margin. That's du dq. That's what I'm calling du dq at Q bar. So that's the kind of really cool role played by P bar. Other sort of things it captures are sort of possible quality differentiation. If this firm is making a highly quality adjusted version of its good, then that would all be embodied in P bar, because quality presumably shifts the utility function up. It also crucially captures diminishing marginal utility. You might imagine that there's some firm that's kind of so big and productive in your economy that it's kind of, you might think, they should just take over the universe. They're so good at what they do that no other firm making anything remotely similar should exist. But of course, you have to sort of think on the margin. It's like, the consumers like that good less and less, presumably, the more they consume of it. And the price, again, is a perfect sufficient statistic for that marginal utility. Finally, it's just units. I mean, when we look at firms in data, we never know the units of what they're producing. There's some arbitrary thing like number of widgets or tons of rolls or something, DOFs, as David had. So anyway, the beauty of price is that they convert the physical units of whatever good is being produced that this thing is measured into utility relevant units, which are the relevant units. Anyway, second point, marginal. So I've already alluded to this, but obviously the productivity of a firm on the margin in terms of the marginal productivity and the input inside a firm could be very different depending on which margin we're talking about. So this is the physical manifestation of that. The other one was more in the utility, the eyes of the consumer's manifestation of that I like less and less that firm the more it produces. That's in here. The firm itself might be less and less productive the more it physically puts in, the more it puts in. So that would mean declining marginal utility of an input, or as a marginal productivity of an input. Anyway, the point is that it's the margin that matters for thinking about, everything here in today's lecture and in much of the course that follows. So anyway, the M is kind of very important in this VMPX definition. Just highlight that, of course, that's obviously different than the average product of input X, which we might define as just the total revenue produced. The average value product might just be revenue per unit of the input, like revenue per worker or something. There are lots of reasons to expect positive correlations across firms, maybe, or across the world within a given good between VMPX and VAPX. But I can also think of lots of reasons to expect a negative correlation or a zero correlation. So for those reasons, kind of, I always sort of try to remind myself, VMPX is what I wish I could measure, and other things like VAPX are what, unfortunately might be the best thing we can measure. And so we have to sort of ask how correlated is the thing we can measure with the thing we wish we could measure, and be wary of, settings where that correlation might not be so obvious. Okay, final comment is that, that this thing is defined as it is, which is price times df dx. That's obviously different from what I've written down here, the derivative with respect to x of open bracket price times f. The distinction is that, sometimes you can think about a firm as their revenue is kind of price times quantity, or in other words, price times F. And so the part of the firm's problem is asking questions related to this, which is, if I put a bit more X into my firm, how will it affect my revenue? And that works through two channels. One is how much will I physically produce? The other is how will I optimally change my price as I physically produce more? But all of those discussions are not germane. They're not part of this definition. For starters, and the usefulness of this definition, as we'll see in a second, is to do with this definition, not this one. And so, so thinking through how will the firm change its price is useful for lots of questions, but for misallocation, it's not a first order usefulness, as I'll sort of argue in a second. There are settings, like famously studied settings. Monopolist competition with CES preferences is one that comes to mind, where it just so happens that sort of across firms, their marginal, if they're all facing the same CS preferences, then their marginal revenue product of an input would be proportional to their value marginal product of that same input. But that's kind of a coincidence that happens, and I don't think it's very generic or very general. So that's why I'm mentioning this kind of caveat. Okay, so what happened here? Yeah, okay, so now we can talk about misallocation. So remember, the best allocation was one where, as I wrote it, du dq times df dx is equal to a constant. But remember, all we've done here is sort of pointed out that it's often reasonable to follow the convention that prices reflect du dq. And so, in other words, we can write what the planner would do as set VMPX equal to that constant for all active firms and inputs. So in other words, the planner would just sort of make sure that everywhere in the economy, every time the right firms, the active set of firms are being used, within that set, the VMPX for a given type of input, like labor, would be constant across all those active firms. So the corollary kind of is obvious that, since that's the best, every other allocation has to display something different. And one thing that would be different is this, that is there exists at least one I and or M such that, the value marginal product in that I is not equal to the aforementioned constant, And so we often sometimes capture that by another definition that sort of some people might call a wedge, which would be the sort of the ratio of the value marginal product of an input divided by that constant. And we would observe that sort of the planner would want that thing to be 1 for every firm, equal to a constant, and the constant would be 1 for every firm. But the misallocated actual economy, presumptively, would not have this. It would have wedges that are not equal to 1. It would have wedge dispersion, in other words. It would have some firms that are lower than 1 and some that are higher than 1. And it's wedge dispersion that would be indicative of misallocation. Okay, so, of course, why might misallocation happen? We haven't talked about that. We just sort of said, suppose there was an allocation, it would be misallocated if and only if it displayed this, that is variance or dispersion in the value marginal product of a given input across uses in the economy. Why might misallocation happen? Well, a lot of this course is going to be about that, but we already know some answers as economists who've sort of studied things like the first welfare theorem. Economists call these things market failures. We sort of know that market allocations achieve the first best kind of, if market failures don't exist, and probably almost always don't achieve the first best if market failures do exist. So, examples of market failures that exist, and are important, and some of the discussions you're going to see in coming lectures aim to sort of try to quantify some of the costs of these market failures in terms of their misallocative cost, would be taxes on production, subsidies on production, regulations that are imposed on production. Those things, of course, might have some higher objective, like raising government revenue, which maybe is good, even though it might, for some reason, the best way to raise revenue might have to distort production, but it would distort production. So if we're interested in aggregate productivity being low, we would be interested in asking if there are sort of taxes that distort production, and hence lead to misallocation. Things like corruption probably would. That would be a case where firms are asked to pay bribes, let's say, or do other things that are directly unproductive, but in different extents on the margin, right? So to the extent that's true, that would act like a wedge that is dispersed across firms. Expropriation risk would be another example. Imagine that one of your X's is like investing, but you're a firm that you're thinking, well, if I invest, I'll just get held up by the government. Expropriation, let's call that. And that would mean that I probably wouldn't invest, which would mean that sort of the value marginal product of me investing would be high. If I were to do it, I might keep doing it until the value marginal product of investing is the same as every other firm. But given that I know I'm going to get held up, I'll hold back on that investment, and hence the VMPX might be higher in my firm than in some other firm that's not facing that expropriation risk. Okay, we can go on. So we can think about asymmetric information. That has many manifestations, things like hold up between buyers and sellers, credit constraints. We often think of a microfoundation for that as asymmetric information, that the lender can't verify that the borrower firm is kind of using the loan in the way that the firm said it would. And to the extent that that's not visible or verifiable or monitorable, that could lead to inefficient allocation of credit, which we sometimes call a sort of, it sometimes manifests itself as a credit constraint, a contract that a bank might write with a firm that says you can borrow at an interest rate R, but only up to some limit. That would be a constraint and it would be a binding constraint if the firm wanted, to borrow more than that amount. Incomplete contracts appear in other environments, that are familiar. At a higher level, we can think about market power. Of course, market power you could also microfound as deriving from, for example, asymmetric information between firms and their customers. The inability to perfectly price discriminate is a form of asymmetric information, and market power sort of happens when firms kind of can set prices but can't fully price discriminate. Of course, I described that sort of in the output market sense of like a standard oligopoly. But of course, we also know that firms, when they buy, probably might have some market power too, when they buy labor or materials, for example. Pure externalities, I'll come back to that, but that could be embraced here. There's a little subtlety there that I'll come back to, but for now, it's certainly a market failure. Irrational firms often don't get talked about as a market failure, but I think it's important element of discussion in the type of literature we're talking about over the next lectures, that I would call, as opposed to the type of irrationality I mentioned earlier, here I would kind of really just point to failure to profit maximize. So there is an X that is profit maximizing. The first welfare theorem assumes the firms choose that, that they're price taking and profit maximizing. If they're not profit maximizing, then then we can't apply the first welfare theorem. It acts like a market failure. One example of that would be not just a firm that's kind of stupid in the sense, if you forgive the word, a form of irrational, but of course you could imagine the firms are a collection of agents, of actors. There's no there's no reason to expect they would necessarily do what's sort of best for profits, and we might call that some agency problems. Anyway, the bottom line, of course, as you've seen probably in your study of macroeconomics of market failures, is that effectively at the end of the day, what's going wrong is that a given firm, let's call it I, is acting as if it pays on the margin more or less for a given input than some other firm does. And that's what this basically says. Now, if you're struggling to think about that, think about market power. It's like, we don't normally phrase it this way, but it acts this way, which is to say that like that firm who's thinking of hiring, let's say, some more labor and hence would expand, they know that one cost of expansion is that they would slide down their own demand curve and hence have to lower prices, and that would harm the profits they were making on inframarginal units. And so in some sense, the cost of hiring labor is not just the wage of labor, it's also the markup that they were getting on existing units at the start of that thought experiment. So that's a case where if one firm has a high markup and another firm has a low markup, even though they pay the same price for labor, they're acting as if they're paying a different price on the margin for labor. And that's why it too comes down to this bottom line. Okay, so the reason this I think is useful, this discussion, is it sort of lets us think about the difference between sort of misallocation as a source of low aggregate productivity and bad technology, if it kind of quote unquote as a source of low aggregate productivity. There's no easy answers to the question of like which of these is bigger. I think to some people, could be thought of as almost a little bit tautological, because some people say, well, everything you can think of as an A, I could just call misallocation. And other people say, well, everything you think of misallocation, I could just think of as a bad technology. Some of that is definitional, some of that is semantics, some of that is philosophy. But so you'll kind of have to make up your own mind and stick to your own conventions and then be kind of internally consistent. But here's how I sort of think about some of those debates, some of those discussions. So the key thing about misallocation, as I've kind of set this up in order to define this, as I previously did, is that we're talking about inputs that are in fixed aggregate national supply. So the problem that's going on is that input is being used in the wrong way within my nation across the uses. So in some sense, as I already stressed, the key thing to remember there is that, like, if you're thinking about improving the world by fixing misallocation, you must be thinking about fixing the world with a reallocation. You must be thinking about basically taking some firm J and removing labor, let's say, from it in order to free up labor to put it into some other firm I. That, once we've got an aggregate input constraint, this is just mathematical necessity. So in some sense, if you're thinking, I'm thinking about something that's wrong with the world that in principle policy could make better, and you're thinking of labeling that thing misallocation, you're inherently thinking that there's an input that's in fixed supply and that you could move around. And by corollary, you'd have to make some firm have less of it and another firm have more. So in some sense, you're sort of thinking about something that's going to harm, quote unquote, one firm and help, quote unquote, another firm, at least to the extent that, like, shrinking the amount they have is harming a firm. Okay, so another less obvious point about misallocation is that it is always generating a rent, or what sometimes people might call revenues. But it's, so in other words, if you're thinking about misallocation that in some sense just makes resources from society disappear into thin air, nobody gets them, nobody gets any money from them, then it's not misallocation. It's bad technology. So the reason there are rents is that sort of as soon as VMPX, if somebody's paying W for the input M, WM for the input M, but their sort of value marginal product of using that thing, again, this is just a definition, so it has to follow, is VMPX. If VMPX divided by W minus 1 is not 0, then in some sense they're making money off of hiring that input. And that's what we could call or often define as a rent. And if they're selling Q of those inputs, Q outputs at the time, then Q times that marginal rent would be the total rent enjoyed. So of course, in the case of markups, we're used to calling these things pure profits and hence kind of thinking about them as rents. In the case of taxes, there are where a tax on labor would drive a wedge between the W that the laborer earns and the MPX that the firm gets out of that amount of labor that the firm acts like it's paying. And those rents go to the government, the person who collects the tax revenue. But either way, there has to be a money trail. So if you're sort of thinking about things that are corruption due to misallocation, ask yourself the question, is there a money trail? Anyway, so by contrast, bad technology, quote unquote, as a source of low aggregate productivity is in this sort of framework, something about the A's. Remember, it's about the constraint on the set of techniques the firm I knows how to use. So in that sense, the A's could be something that could be improved like for free almost, without possibly an aggregate constraint. So in principle, I could teach one person how to fish and teach someone else how to fish, and that would increase person number one's AI and also person number two's. So these A's are not only exogenous to the firm by definition, the way we set it up, a constraint the firm can't do anything about, but there are also some things that do change exogenously in the world around us, like a hurricane happens, and that's bad. And the way you would see that in this model is that would reduce some firms' AIs. Also, some exogenous gifts of good technology do arise. We sometimes think about these as externalities in that context. But, for example, if you have foreign firms in your economy and you think that they're in some sense teaching, whether by deliberately or not, teaching domestic firms, or maybe there's spillovers through worker mobility or something. These things often get called FDI spillovers. Those are kind of, from the purpose of the firms in this country, those are exogenous, gifts of better A's that came for free, you could say. Obviously, there might not be free to attract FDI, but for the purpose of this thought experiment, this transfer is free. Finally, however, you can think about some policies that governments might pursue that the whole point might be to raise A's. This could be like teaching firms something to, again, raise that sort of ignorance constraint on the techniques they know about. We think of education, the governments do sometimes in that sort of light. But another example would be building infrastructure. So if infrastructure is the type of things that tends to be the firms don't produce, the governments produce, then you can sort of think about it in a reduced form way as, when I build good roads in my country, I'm just helping the firms to have higher A's. They can produce more Q with the same X. They devote less resources to transporting because the roads are better. And of course, those A's might not come for free. It costs the government money to build the roads and improve them. But from this framework, think about them for now as A's. Finally, another good example would be removing red tape. We don't think that might just be making the organ of government, the organ of customs procedures just more efficient. That just lets firms produce more Q for fewer work for the same number of workers. That would be the way I'd think about red tape. Anyway, so the bottom line of thinking about this distinction for me is that sort of, improving A is usually going to sort of push out, by definition, it pushes out one's firm production possibility frontier. It therefore also pushes out the country's production possibility frontier. And that might be sort of free. And so it doesn't come at a cost. By contrast, changing the X's is not free. Remember, it's not about moving out the PPF. It's about sort of maybe choosing a different point along it. Sort of getting the economy to a point on its own PPF would be reallocating the little X's. Now, it's very unclear to me if I take a given firm and ask, should I make that firm bigger, raise its XAI or not? It's very unclear to me whether the answer is yes or no. Remember, when I do it, I'm going to help that firm get bigger. I'm going to make some other firm smaller. Is that a good reallocation? It's very not clear to me. So when I think about misallocation, I sort of think the answer is not at all obvious. When I think about improving A, the answer is almost always that yes, that will be good. There are some caveats to that, but it almost, I think, in realistic scenarios, improving the nation's PPF is likely to be good. Okay, so the final thing I wanted to say about this is that there's a couple caveats about everything I just said that should be borne in mind, and I would also highlight that I think these are areas where it's not just that I've omitted them, and these are areas where I think gaps in kind of research knowledge might be particularly high, in my opinion, but maybe that's just my opinion. But anyway, I've taken the big X's as exogenous, but they might be, of course, endogenous. There are many reasons to think that, in fact, that they go in kind of a good direction. That that countries that have higher aggregate productivity also have higher big X's. Maybe the incentives to invest time in your own education are higher in higher aggregate productivity countries. So to the extent that big X is something like human capital, that makes sense. Second, input-output linkages. So everything I said here about sort of the variance of wedges being sufficient for misallocation is true if the inputs are in fixed aggregate supply, and probably not true if inputs are not in aggregate fixed supply. So an example of inputs that are not in fixed aggregate supply are non-factor inputs, in other words, intermediates that are produced by other firms. So then you get something called double marginalization, where basically it's not whether the wedges are dispersed that matters, it's if you read this very nice Bakai-Fari paper, you'll see that sort of in some sense what matters is whether there's dispersion in sort of the amount of double marginalization across all paths from raw factors of production to final consumption. If that thing is not dispersed, then you still don't have misallocation. But if that sort of pathwise notion of dispersion of sort of aggregate wedges is dispersed, then you do have misallocation. Third, I skipped over pure externalities. You can always think about those without loss here as just a firm that's a multi-product firm. It makes both its good and the externality good, like whether it's pollution or knowledge spillovers or whatever you want. You could also, of course, think about that in this framework as like the firm not I is affecting AI's productivity, AI directly. Finally, I've glossed over extensive margin concerns. Nothing I said was incorrect, but it bears. When the world has increasing returns to scale technologies, then this statement, value marginal product of X is constant among active firm pairs, is still true. It just needs to be used with some caution, because sort of something that markets could very much get wrong is not the MPX among active participants, but who are the active participants. If you're sort of thinking of like that your economy is missing some superstar firms that just haven't even been born yet, you're thinking in this light. Okay, so with that said, I want to sort of foreshadow very briefly sort of some themes that are going to come in the next few weeks, starting tomorrow. The next lecture is tomorrow at the same time. And so, Eric Verhoeven will be talking tomorrow, and this will be followed next week by Jing Kai, sort of on the sort of themes that I kind of relate. These characterizations are not perfect. Themes will overlap, of course, but really sort of getting into the weeds of like, what are these good techniques? What are these AIs that are limits on good techniques? What are some policies that appear to sort of help firms to sort of have access to better techniques and hence raise their AIs? Also, we glossed over sort of what's happening inside this very interesting and important max problem. I sort of wrote it down very glibly, but as economists, a lot of what we do should be sort of just very quite positive understanding of how that works. What are the techniques available? Okay, so then, and you can think about understanding management and training in that light, I believe. Pete Klenow is going to give lecture 4 and sort of really get into a lot of the details of the misallocation thread I've already opened, thinking about how do we measure this stuff? How do we quantify this stuff? Which wedges look big? Which wedges look small? Is this sort of misallocation hypothesis quantitatively important, which it very much seems to be. Lectures that come later will then dig into sort of particular input markets and output markets. So sort of capital labor distortions, contracting distortions in input markets. Mackenzie, Woodruff, and Machiavello will talk about those themes. Think about those as sort of measuring, diagnosing, understanding policies that fix wedges in input markets. Lauren Bergquist will talk about in lecture 7 about competition in product markets, and think about that as kind of wedges that are due to imperfect competition in the output market. Finally, in our last lecture, Rekha Juhasz will, as David already mentioned, will talk about industrial policy. So this is, one space of policy that many people think is interesting, because it part of its effectiveness might hinge on a claim or the belief that it might improve misallocation and or just sort of improve the spread of good technology. A lot of debate about whether that's true, as David already alluded to, but Rekha will kind of lead you through some of that discussion and what we know and what we don't know, et cetera, about those ideas. I want to just flag before we end by sort of, want to flag that this is an incredibly active and interesting research area. We haven't been able to put together, and I'm sure your patience would eventually wear thin, like an infinitely long course that would cover everything. We tried to focus on some important highlights, and we're very grateful that these lecturers have volunteered their time to contribute. But, I just want to sort of leave this last slide up and in order to highlight there are lots of things that aren't going to get as much attention as they might need, and that are great active research areas where a lot more work is needed. Development firm space interacts with other fields like international economics, IO, public finance, environmental, labor, urban, the fluctuation side of macro, as well as the aggregate side of macro that I've already alluded to, household economics, because a lot of firms are household firms, behavioral economics, political economy. So rich intersections between all of these areas and firms in developing countries that aren't going to get as much attention in the coming weeks as maybe we wish they could. And then just I'd again reiterate that one could have very legitimate objectives other than aggregate productivity, such as distributional concerns. For example, self-employment, offering more than just profits to the people who choose to be self-employed, especially in developing countries, perhaps. And also PF, public finance, governments raising revenue to fund public goods and using firms to achieve that goal might distort aggregate productivity, but might nevertheless be good, because that's the best way to fund public goods that are important for other goals. And so, I think a lot of what I've talked about today has been fairly glib on non-aggregate productivity considerations, but I didn't want to sort of belittle those considerations. They're extremely important. And finally, there's a classic problem that sort of, a lot of very important and interesting firms are informal, and data limitations and other limitations have often sort of hindered our ability to understand that side of the economy fully. And so this sort of informal versus formal distinction is an area that, another area that we wish could be covered even more than it will be covered. Okay, so with that, I'll stop. I want to thank everyone for being here, and again, thank the lectures that are going to follow in the coming days, starting tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern time, with Eric Verhoeven talking about firm upgrading. And thank you all for being here. We'll stop now.
Thank you very much.